Good morning.
Hello.
All right. Welcome back, everybody, to the Now What Business series that we're offering here. My name is Jenny Bellinger. I am your host and facilitator for this event, our weekly webinar series here. This week's presentation is by Carol Sparks, and I'll be giving an introduction to her in just a moment. I want to introduce some of our other experts who are on the line here to answer any questions that you may have, in addition to any questions that you might have for Carol after her presentation. First of all, I want to start off by letting everybody know if you do have questions, you can either put them in the chat. So at the bottom of your screen, or if you're joining us from your phone, you have a way to pull up the chat feature and ask a question. You can also use our Q&A feature. The Q&A allows you to ask a particular expert. You can tag them, or you can just put it in the Q&A, and I will let our experts know when a question has been asked, and I will get those answered as quickly as possible for you. So that's the first thing. Second thing is I want to make sure you guys all know that this webinar is happening on what's today? The 13th? Is that right? So Wednesday, May 13th. So all information presented today is true and accurate as of today. So if you're watching this on the replay in a few weeks, things may have changed. So we're just letting you know that to the best of our ability, we're making sure we're giving you accurate information as of today. Carol has given us access to her presentation and also a resource list, which is being uploaded to the website where we are hosting all of the videos for this series. So you can go to levelupcoachllc.com and then click on the Now What Business series at the top of the page, and you'll have access to the PowerPoint as well as the resource list and all videos from our previous series coming up. So to introduce our experts, last week our presenter was Joanne May from the Small Business Development Center. She's the director there, and she gave a presentation on pivoting in times of COVID, and she gave some great information about the SBA PPP loan, so as if there's not enough acronyms there, and she did a great job. So if you want more information about that, you'll want to go check out that video. Our first presenter was Megan Martin with Conquer Consulting. Megan is an executive career coach, and she presented on mindset during this time. Our second presenter was Marcel Brown with Marcel Brown Technology. He's been in the technology industry for 25 years and running his own small business for the past 18 years as Marcel Brown Tech. And he gave his presentation was on technology in COVID and how to make sure that you're up to date and ready to work from home and go back to work eventually as well. Kurt will be our presenter next week. Kurt is with Rickoff and Associates, and he will be presenting on, what's your title, Kurt? Oh, he's got to unmute first.
Every time, trying to be nice. Lessons learned by small businesses through this the crisis, and how to correct them moving forward and avoid them in the future.
Very good. Thank you so much, Kurt. So Kurt has been a small business advisor for, I think it was 20 years on your bio, if that's correct. And so he's been doing that for a while. And our presenter today is Carol Sparks. She is an attorney at Sparks Law Office. Sparks Law Office was started in 2009, and she has been an attorney, oh my gosh, I don't think it says in your bio. How long have you been an attorney, Carol?
I feel like that's one of those questions you can't ask a woman about their age, right, Jenny? I have been practicing law since 2004.
There we go. Awesome. So she's been doing this for a while, and she has been a small business advisor in the legal world for that time. And so her presentation today is actually tools to protect your workplace, workforce, and work product. Just a reminder to all of our participants during the course of the presentation, if you have questions, you can put those questions into the chat or into the Q&A feature, and I will get those questions to Carol as quickly as possible and whenever it makes sense. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and start the presentation for you. Ooh, or not. Just kidding. Try that again. It's not wanting to do that. So I'm going to restart PowerPoint here. I apologize for that.
No, you're good. I'll just do a little filler.
Yeah, go ahead. Well, please do.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Let's just start today by saying thank you to Jenny for being our moderator of our Now What series. And let's just take also the opportunity. I just want to say thank you to each of the Now What team members for coming together so quickly, and for collaborating on what are important topics for business owners today. I personally believe that these topics are not important or relevant because of COVID-19, but rather COVID-19 has really caused business owners to start asking themselves some questions that maybe that they haven't asked themselves before in terms of mindset or where they're at with their business in terms of technology. Are they ready to pivot if and when something happens? I spend a lot of my time and I have spent a lot of my practice talking to business owners about what kind of protection they want. I've had the opportunity to counsel business owners for over 15 years. Some of you may know that I was raised by small business owners. So I've had the unique opportunity to sit down at the table and listen to the conversations of what kind of protection business owners want. In short, business owners typically want the same things. They want to continue to do what they're passionate about with the people that they trust, for the people in their communities, and to provide for the people they love. I think most business owners are surprised when I tell them I can help mitigate their business risks that will create the protection that they desire and ultimately create the peace of mind that they deserve. So I do this through the lens of protection planning, and I think that protection can best be broken down into three main areas: protecting your workplace, protecting your workforce, and protecting your work product. Today, what I'd like to do is look at the topic of protection through the lens of reopening in light of some news that happened yesterday in Madison County, and the weeks that are ahead for most of us, or to the extent that your business is already open, through the lens of continuing your operations, for scaling up your operations, and for doing it in a way, that mitigates your risk. So let's just start right on in. Let's hit that next slide, Jenny, and talk about number one, protecting your workplace. And let's just advance one more. Under the federal law, so this is where we start, our private employers are bound to federal law when they talk about their employees and the health and safety within their workplace. So employers are required to provide a workplace free of known health and safety hazards. What do we know today? We know that COVID-19 is a respiratory disease that spreads from person to person, typically those people in close contact with one another. So the CDC has advised that that's within 6 feet, and through respiratory droplets produced when an infected person coughs or sneezes or things of that nature. Looking at the CDC, this is where we get a lot of our guidance from. The CDC has advised that businesses and employers can prevent and can slow the spread of COVID-19 within the workplace. So this is the threshold, this is the standard. Now employers are required to prevent and to slow the spread. So business owners and employers need to ask themselves, how can I decrease the spread? How can I lower the impact to my workplace? How do I reduce the transmission among my employees, among my customers? How do I maintain healthy operations? How do I maintain a healthy work environment? So we use the CDC guidance to point to that. So I just really want to review a great deal of what the CDC has put out, so we can get an understanding of how best to protect that workplace. The CDC does acknowledge that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to every business. Industries are different, size of businesses are different, our local communities and each state is facing its own spread, and so there are a lot of variations in terms of approach. So what does the CDC say? They said, number one, go ahead and follow the White House guidelines for opening up America again. Oh, and follow your state guidelines. Oh, and follow your local guidelines. So here's the first elephant in the room that I want to talk about today. What happens when federal, state, and local guidelines differ? I think that is the question that many of our Madison County non-essential businesses that are planning to reopen are asking themselves today on May 13th, in light of the county coming in and saying Madison County can proceed to reopen contrary to the state of Illinois executive order. So how do we do that? Where are our differences? First of all, you may be familiar with the concept of federalism, state versus federal, who gets to play in which sandbox, right? And so it really becomes a question of who is responsible for this. Okay, so who's responsible for what? So the federal government is responsible for the health and safety of the country as a whole. The state of Illinois is responsible for the safety and health of the residents of the state of Illinois. What about our local communities? Well, they're responsible for the residents within those communities. And so here, where I sit, I have my office in Troy. So my regulations are dependent upon all three: federal, state, and local regulations, okay? What happens when they differ? We typically look at who has the power to enforce, okay? You may have heard the governor say in the past weeks, I'm going to give it to the local jurisdictions to regulate, to enforce. And then you may have heard him say yesterday, to the extent that counties differ, those counties are going to be, they're going to receive less funding. They could have their own risks. So really the question becomes, how is your business regulated? If you are a non-essential business and you're planning to reopen and you don't have any state licensures and you've contacted your insurance agent, now I've talked to many insurance agent brokers today, and they've all told me the same thing. Your insurance policy is still in place. It's still in force. If you operate, you're good. However, no insurance policy that I have heard of in the last few weeks protects anybody from getting sick through COVID. Okay, so I just want to pin drop that. And let's go back and talk about enforcement as a whole. So if you're planning to reopen, and I don't want to get too far off topic here, but if you're planning to reopen and you are licensed by the state, you need to follow state guidelines. If you are not, you need to follow your local guidelines. Also check with your cities and villages, which may differ from your county. If you have a business license that's required for you to operate your business, you may want to know how your city stands on you reopening, okay? But let's talk about enforcement in the employer's obligation to provide that safe workplace. Osha is the agency that's responsible for enforcing the employer's mandated obligation to provide that workplace that's free of known health and safety hazards. What do we know? We know that COVID-19 is a safety and health hazard, all right? OSHA's role, they investigate complaints. Typically these come from employees employer reported fatalities, hospitalizations, accidents. Their job is to identify potentially hazardous exposures and to help ensure that the employers are taking actions to mitigate those hazards and to protect the employees. Right now, what OSHA is seeing in terms of the biggest complaints are lack of PPE and lack of training. Let's move on to the next slide.
Carol, before we move
Go
on,
ahead.
we do have a question from one of our participants.
Sure.
Kiara wants to know, how does OSHA come into play for shared workspaces?
Well, it depends upon, so OSHA regulates the employer.
Mm-hmm.
Any workspace that the employer has an agreement to use, the employer is required to make sure that that workspace is ready, is clean, is hazard free. Okay. And so it's the employer's responsibility to make sure that their landlord, that shared workspace, the other people are also following the same set of rules and are also bound to the same obligations, to the CDC cleaning guidelines, to making sure that if there is a case of infection, how is that mitigated? How is that handled? And so for shared workspaces, there needs to be, and I'll get to this really in the next slide, Jenny, if you just want to go ahead and advance that, every business owner needs to adopt an infectious disease plan. What happens if and when something happens? And so that workplace shouldn't really look any different if it's a shared workspace or if it's an individual workspace. It's just the number of people that have to be consulted and agree upon what the plan looks like is going to increase. Okay. So let's just hit those tools to protect that workplace. Prevention is the key, right? So what does prevention look like? You have to remind your employees of good hygiene practices. You have to promote hand washing. You should provide supplies and appropriate PPE for cleaning and disinfection of the workspaces. One question that I have received a lot over the last few weeks is, do my employees need to wear face coverings? Face coverings are recommended by the CDC in public settings where social distancing measures are difficult to maintain. If you are interfacing with people in less than a 6-foot radius, then yes, you should be utilizing face coverings. What else can we do to prevent? Encourage your workers to stay home if they're sick. This seems pretty straightforward, but it also leads to the next question that I've heard over and over. Should I require a doctor's note? No, the answer is no. Employers should not require sick employees to provide a COVID positive test result or a doctor's note in order to validate their illness, their leave request, or their return to work request. Follow the CDC guidelines and process for what happens if and what happens when someone is ready to return to work. And I'll share that link with you all in the resources after the presentation today. What else does prevention look like? Respiratory etiquette, how you cover your coughs and how you cover your sneezes. It seems so foolish to say out loud. We're adults, we're not in the 2nd grade any longer, but for your own protection, I recommend that you restate even the simplest rules, right? If we can all agree on how to wash our hands for 20 seconds, what to use, soap, right? Soap and water. Hand sanitizer, if you're using that, has to have an alcohol content of at least 60%. And what happens when we cough and sneeze? We use tissues. We don't allow our dirty tissues to sit on any surface, and we place that dirty tissue in the wastebasket. Very standard prevention measures, but really does mean a lot in terms of what the employer is willing to do to ensure the safety measures within the workplace. An employer who says, here are all the things that I've done, I'm making a good faith effort, their health and safety is my top priority, goes a lot further than saying, oh, well, we do that. I just can't show you, Osha, that we do that because I've never really put anything in writing. I've never really formally trained my employees on this because it's common sense and everyone knows. Don't rely on common sense, rely on documentation. Let's see, what else have other questions that I've received lately. Do I need to require temperature screening? Screening your employees is your option. Are you permitted to use it as an employer? Yes. Can the methods include temperature screening? Yes. You can require that your employees take their temperature at your work site or before coming to the work site and then report to you that their temperature is less than 100.4 degrees. If you choose to utilize a screening technique where your employees or you are conducting the screening at your work site, then you must follow the CDC protocol in order to keep people safe in that process. So you must use that guideline, and that guidance is out there for you. Okay, so what else can we do? And I mentioned this just a little bit ago. It's important to develop an infectious disease preparedness plan for if and when you have an outbreak. Businesses are going to reopen. The expectation that, oh, we've all been safe, we've all been in our homes, and we're not going to get sick when we come back together is a fallacy. So be prepared, be ready, and be ready what happens when. So how do we start that process? First thing that you need to do in order to start your plan is to review the OSHA guidance. And again, I have a link for that in the resources page. There is OSHA guidance that's specific to your industry, specific to the distance that your employees work from one another, who they have contact with, who they don't have contact with. Is it construction, manufacturing, retail, transportation? The CDC is also putting out some great guidelines. When this started in March, there was one resource for business owners that the CDC put out. And since then, over the last 2 months, the CDC has put out some great details that's industry specific on how to keep people safe. Even food delivery drivers now have CDC guidance. So please pay attention to that. And I have several links of that in the resources page as well. As you're creating your plan, you need to identify where and how your workers might be exposed. Again, this is going to come through that OSHA guidance and how many feet apart are we. You're going to ask yourselves, can we minimize face-to-face contact between our employees? Can we minimize face-to-face contact between the general public? Can I assign work tasks to my workers that allow them to maintain that social distancing? What about with customers? What about visitors? What about delivery that we may get as a business? Ask yourself, can your employees telework? Yes, we are reopening our businesses, but the encouragement is that telework is still an okay thing. And we don't know yet how that as a culture we're going to change out of this. Telework may be something that many businesses go to. Your plan needs to include how you will manage sick employees. Again, we're actively encouraging our sick employees to stay home, but what if they show up to work and they're sick? Your plan needs to address that. It needs to address how we're going to separate them, where we're going to separate them to, how we're going to relieve them from their duties that day and send them home. And what happens then when someone returns to work? What happens when they want to return to work? Employees who are symptomatic are required to stay home for the longer of 7 days from the onset of symptoms, or 72 hours after your fever is resolved. So again, there's some CDC guidance. There's a CDC link in the information that I'm putting out to walk you through those. But know that when you're asking yourselves, well, what do I do about someone who was symptomatic? Check the CDC. What about once someone's sick, who needs to know and how do I share that information, right? That's a big question. Employers should inform fellow employees of possible exposure in the workplace. Employers also have a duty to maintain confidentiality under the ADA, under HIPAA. So these are things that the employer has to balance both, okay?
While you're pausing there for a moment,
Sure.
Kira had an additional question regarding the OSHA, and she wanted to know, should they have necessary OSHA signage in the building?
You are required as an employer to maintain certain notices. That would include federal OSHA notices as well as state notices. So any required notice you need to have in your workplace. That's a question I've also been getting from employers. What happens when we're teleworking? Well, if you're teleworking and you have a shared drive, go ahead and put those notices in a shared drive. Then train your employees on where they're located. These the notices are for the benefit of your employees, and they're required by law so that your employees don't feel that they can't come to you with certain things, okay? The CDC requires cleaning and disinfection after a person is suspected to have COVID or confirmed to have COVID in an office setting. Again, follow the CDC guidelines for what that looks like. There's a link in the resources that I will provide. It talks about what are we cleaning, how are we cleaning, what are we using to clean. I heard today from a referral partner of mine who owns a cleaning company. She reminded our team that there is a difference between antibacterial and antiviral, and COVID-19 is a virus. So don't expect that you're going to eliminate COVID-19 with an antibacterial wipe. It's not its job. Then you have the obligation to train your employees on all of the guidelines that apply to your workspace and your work setting. I've been in a lot of conversations this week. One really sticks out in my mind. You have an obligation to train your employees, but there's also some peace of mind that the employees will receive with that training. So don't do it out of obligation to your employees. Do it out of a gift to your employees. Give them the assurance that you're doing everything necessary to bring them back to work and that you are committed to their health and safety. Again, I know I'm throwing a lot out at you. I do have a resource page that I'm putting that we're going to share, has a lot of these links in it. So if we don't have any more questions about the workplace, Jenny, I'm going to switch gears and I'm going to talk about workforce. I'm going to take that as we're good. So I'm going to, I want to just address how to protect our workforce. Some of you may have attended the Zoom conference that Kurt, along with his wife, Mindy, Joanne, and Jenny and I held on March 23rd, right after all of this hit and after the first economic stimulus package came out, where we walked through Families First Coronavirus Response Act. I want to touch on those briefly because the provisions of this help us understand how are we truly protecting our workforce. And really the way I've shaped this part of our time together is, what are our employees entitled to? So under the First Families Coronavirus Response Act, our employees are entitled to paid leave. The rule is that an employer is required to provide 2 weeks of paid sick time to the extent that an employee is unable to work or telework due to a series of needs, whether the employee was subject to local quarantine, isolation, federal, state, or local orders, whether the employee was advised to self-quarantine because they're symptomatic, because they're just concerned about COVID-19, if they've been advised by a healthcare provider, Third, if the employee is symptomatic and now they need to go find out, they need that diagnosis and they need that treatment. So those were the things that we saw early on that we may see again as we're reopening. So the rule here is that the employer is required to pay 2 weeks of paid sick leave under those circumstances at the employee's rate of pay, regular rate of pay. So full-time employees get 80 hours, part-time employees get their equivalent of their average hours worked over that 2-week period based on their regular rate of pay. And I'm going to just, Kurt, if I have misspoke on that or clarification, feel free to jump in on that. The next slide, Jenny, this is the circumstances that may arise that look a little bit different, and the rate of pay is different. Here, 2/3 rate of pay applies if an employee needs to take time off work because they're caring for an individual that was subject to any of the 3 categories that we already talked about. If they're caring for a son or daughter and schools closed, childcare providers are closed, daycares are closed, things of that nature. Or if the employee is experiencing any other condition that the Secretary of the Health and Human Services has told us to treat under this provision. So in short, the full-time employees, again, are entitled to 80 hours. Part-time employees are entitled to their average number of hours over the typical 2 weeks. Other things to remember about this: there's no carryover. It only applies to the extent that it's needed from April to the end of 2020, and it stops when they return to work. There is no time served requirement for this 2 weeks of pay. It has to be available to every employee, regardless of if they've been your employee for 1 day, 30 days, 300 days, 3,000 days, whatever. There is no waiting period. Employers, you may not require that an employee use other sick leave before they use this. And you cannot say to an employee, I'll only give you this 2 weeks if you find a replacement for your job while you're gone. That can't happen either. All right, so there's one more paid time benefit that we need to address on the next slide. And this is an expansion of the Family Medical Leave Act. And so it's treated a little bit differently. This is called the Emergencies, Family and Medical Leave Expansion Act. And here it takes that 2 weeks and adds on another 10, it's 12. But what it comes up to is the employer is required, between the 2 acts that we have going on here, they're required to provide 12 weeks of leave paid, 2 in the first, 10 under this provision, when an employee is unable to work due to the need to care for their family, son or daughter under the age of 18, if there's no school, if there's no daycare, if there's no child care provider available. This benefit, though, only applies to employees who have worked for you for 30 days. Same formula applies. Full-time employees receive full-time, and part-time based on average work weeks. Again, it's 2/3 the regular rate of pay.
And Carol, we have a question from someone asking, does this pay requirement apply to salary or commission only employees?
All employees.
All employees. All right, there you go, Nancy.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to the next thing that employees are entitled to. Employees are entitled to job restoration. Again, this is another question that I've had a lot over the last few weeks, and I know I'm going to have the question coming up over the next few weeks and months. Job restoration requirement does not apply to an employer with 15 or fewer employees if they had to eliminate a position due to economic conditions. Okay, so if you closed your doors and you said, okay, nobody can work, and now you're going to reopen and nothing has changed for you, then the expectation is you're bringing them back. You have to make a reasonable effort to restore the employee to their position or to another position if it's available. Okay. If you're having economic crisis, which is pretty, everybody seems to be in the majority with that, right? If you're unable to restore the employee back to their position based upon that, then you're required to let them know if and when that position or an equivalent position becomes available. And then there's some timing points, right? So available within a year after the public health emergency has ended, which it certainly has not, or after 3-month anniversary of their leave request. So whichever is earlier, the earlier of those two. I do want to point out, see, some of these things are starting to play in together. If you are awarded PPP, you have until June 30th of 2020, based on the original text of the Act. You have until June 30th of 2020 to restore your full-time employment and salary levels. Joanne and I have been in conversation about this. Joanne is an excellent resource for anything SBA related. And so she shared with me that typically the full-time equivalent under SBA loans, SBA programs is 30 hours. Not so much for PPP. For PPP, the full-time equivalent is 10 hours. So you bring somebody back for 10 hours, they're going to count for your FTE for the PPE. All right. Let's hit the next slide. Employees are entitled to reimbursements. And I think I should start to speed up a little bit or we're going to run out of time. Employees are entitled to reimbursements under the Illinois Wage and Payment and Collection Act for any necessary expenditure that they've incurred within the within the scope of their employment that is directly related to the services that they perform. So a few weeks back, Marcel and I were chatting about this in the webinar, that employers could arguably be required to reimburse employees for cell phones, cell service, home computers, internet costs, travel. So how do employers protect themselves in this? Employers can develop a written policy and require the employee to submit the documentation within the 30-day time frame after incurring the expense, and it's a use it or lose it. If you don't submit it, if you don't follow the policy, then the employer is able to forgo the reimbursement. So let's hit those 3 tools on how to protect yourself, how to protect your workforce. You need to create employment policies if you don't already have them. So examine what you have. Examine your policies for leave, for teleworking, for job restoration, for employee reimbursement, for employee compensation. Train your employees on those policies and consult your tax accountant or payroll servicer about how those paid leave requirements and tax credits go hand in hand. Also, note that if you're using your PPP funds for your working employees, you cannot use those funds for the paid leave under the Family First Act. So that's a good conversation to have with your payroll processor so that you know how to allocate those things. And that's a good questions can be directed to Kurt on those things. All right, let's land this plane a little bit with work product.
Okay, just one quick question. We've got someone who, Sue, asked a question about paid sick leave. She says she was under the impression that the paid sick leave had specific categories, and under categories 1 through 5, and specifically category 5 is capped at $2,000 in the aggregate. Is that correct? There
are caps per employee. There's a daily cap and then there's a total cap. So yes, there are caps on that.
Okay.
Kurt might have those caps at his fingertip. Kurt, you want to answer that?
I could find them. Like you said, all these numbers run into your head, but you're correct. There was some limits on some of those categories. And what I think you're referring to the categories is the if you're taking care of yourself versus others. That was my oversimplification of the categories.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So if you'll take a look at that, Kurt, we'll come back to you during the Q&A session at the end. So Carol can keep going, and Sue, we'll have Kurt address those specific caps at the end, okay?
All right, thanks. Great question. Very, very relevant question. So let's talk about work product. Businesses need to be prepared for the things that are going to impact their work product. Absenteeism, change in patterns of commerce, interrupted supply and delivery. So if you haven't reopened, and even if you have reopened, these are the things that you may still experience. Your workers, they could be absent because they're sick, because they're caring for sick family members, they're caring for children. I think many of us have experienced you're caring for children because we're all e-learning, right? We're all e-learning together. Daycare centers may be closed. You may have at-risk people at home. You might just have employees who are afraid to come into your workplace, and therefore you have an absenteeism. Changes in patterns of commerce. We've already seen a lot of this. Consumer demand for items related to infection prevention has gone up, right? Consumer interest in other goods have declined. I think Amazon has helped us with this interest, right? They say, oh, here are the things you can still get within 2 days, and here are the things that may take a little bit longer. I found it really interesting when I tried to order a book on Amazon that it was going to take like 4 weeks to come in. I'm like, no, I want to read now. Like, now is the time to do some reading. All right, so consumers are changing their shopping hours. They're trying to shop at off-peak times to reduce contact with other people. They have an increased need and desire for those in-home delivery services. I've seen a lot of businesses open up, do things differently in terms of drive-through services, anything that we can do to reduce the person-to-person contact. So these are the aligned with changes in patterns of commerce. Next thing, interrupted service and delivery. Again, we're seeing a little bit of this. This is not to say our supply chain is broken. It is to say that our supplies, when they're coming from geographic areas where there's a severe outbreak of COVID, we may have some delays. We may have some cancellations. We may have those cancellations and delays with or without notice. Okay, my dog food did not show up last week, and that was like, whoa, I have a hungry dog. So you may not be advised of your regular shipments as a consumer, and then as a business owner, you need to know where your materials, where especially your raw goods, if needed, what do you need in terms of for your business? How am I operating my business? So what do I do? Let's hit that next slide, Jenny, and I think we'll just wrap up here today. First, I recommend that you develop a business continuity plan. What does that mean? My business is going to continue to operate even in the midst of crisis, right? So this is why I'm saying the topic isn't a new topic. It's just become a little bit more focused in light of COVID-19. Your plan should identify key employees. They should identify your business functions. Here's my essential business functions. Here are my secondary functions. This plan itself is not only going to help you with a reopening plan or a reduced operation plan, but this is your basis for your rehiring plan. What do I need to take care of first, and how do I staff it? If you're opening with anything less than full hours, without your full workforce, make sure that you're documenting what you're doing. Very, very, very important. In terms of rehiring plans, I hadn't planned to say this, but I want to put this in here for you. I am advising clients right now when they're developing their rehiring plans that the approach is based on business function, key employees, and seniority. Okay, it's not based on who can do what the cheapest. That is not a good rehiring plan. make sure that as you're developing this business continuity plan, you're looking at absenteeism. How many workers does it take? What's my minimum required to keep? Where's my ideal, right? What about supply chain disruptions? How are we getting through these? Can we use temporary workers? Can we find alternative suppliers? What do you need to do now so that you're ready for something that happens in the future? This is what the business continuity plan is all about. What do I do today that allows me to respond timely to these things as they come up in the future? All right, I cannot say this enough. This is very critical to every business that hires employees. Review your employment policies. If you don't have employment policies, okay, but now's a good time to put them into place. Your employment policies should cover attendance. What's the process for reporting illness or absences? Are you using flexible schedules? So that would be rotating teams, staggered shifts, what that looks like for you. If you're using those, you may have never had a need to put that policy in writing before. Now is a good time. What about if you're teleworking? If you don't have a teleworking policy for your employees, now would be a good time to create those. Use of company equipment, leave provisions, confidentiality provisions, all of those things come into play, and those should be reviewed to make sure that your policies are actually keeping up with your business as it's evolving through all of the changes that we've been going through. Other than that, work product, revisit your contractual obligations. What are your loan terms? What are your lease terms? What are my agreements with my vendors? When do I pay them? What if I pay them a little bit late? What about your customers? When are they going to pay you? Things that you should be looking for: flexible delivery, flexible payment terms, force majeure language. What's that? Oh, that is, I don't have to perform today because of XYZ. What we really like is that XYZ is a government regulation that says you can't open for business, so you're excused from performing under this lease. You don't have to pay rent because you can't open your doors. Not every commercial lease has that, but some do. What about early termination provisions? What if you have a vendor that you're stuck under an agreement that now you can't afford and now you're looking for a way out? Look at your early termination requirements, notice, fees, things of that nature. So those are the ways in which I think you should be revisiting what you have in order to protect your work product. Thank you all. Certainly open for questions. I just want to let you know that our team, that's a picture of our team at Sparks Law Office, we're ready, we're willing, and we're able to help you implement the tools that you need in order to achieve your protection and ultimately your peace of mind. So thank you so much. Jenny, you're still on mute.
Thank you. All right, we have another question in the Q&A section. Concern of funds for PPP. I did receive the funds, and from the initial application expressed concern that the funds from receipt of such had to be utilized within 8 weeks. Will there be any extension of the funds and utilization?
My first answer is, based on the way it's written, no, but I'm going to ask Joanne to address that if she has any guidance from the SBA on any changes that are going to be made under that program.
We are waiting on documentation guidance, but have not heard anything about extending that 8-week time frame. So from the time you receive PPP funds, you have 8 weeks to utilize those funds and document that accordingly.
Very good. Thank you. All right.
Probably came from, there's been a lot of discussion on that, hasn't there, Joanne?
There has. Yes.
It's almost outside the SBA, so it's everybody else but the SBA. Not saying the SBA should, but it's people throwing in their 2 cents. That's what it sounds like.
Right.
Gotcha. And Kurt, did you find the cap information?
I did. I went ahead and typed it in the
Perfect.
answers, so it would be easier to type the numbers. There is a cap for the first three reasons. The cap is it's $511 a day, or $551.10, because that's 10 work days, and that's at full pay. And then the reasons 4, 5, and 6, when you're taking care of somebody else or your kids don't have daycare. Again, oversimplification, is $200 a day, and the cap's at $2,000. That's for the ESL. But if it's the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act, it's $200 a day, $10,000 aggregate, because that's all the way up to whatever the 12 weeks, I think. So that's where that came from. And I should back up, for the ESL is not taken care of due to daycare. That's just the Family Emergency Leave Act.
Okay. Very good. Thank you so much. So yeah, for those of you who are on the phone who weren't able to see the typed in thing, I'm glad Kurt was able to address that out, because we do have a couple people who are just calling in,
Gotcha.
so they're not watching that. So yeah, absolutely. So if any of our other participants have questions, we do still have about 10 more minutes here. If you do want to type those questions in, or you can raise your hand in your participant in the chat. You can click on participants, raise your hand if you'd rather not type your question, and if you would rather just say it out loud, I can allow you to turn on your mic and ask your question verbally. So that is also available for people.
There's a new question.
Oh, there sure is. Carol, can you repeat the hours for the FTE definition again?
Oh, sure. So for the PPP, your FTE is equal to 10. For all other SBA programs, it's going to be equal to 30.
Okay. Very good. So hopefully, Carrie, that answered your question for that. All right. Any other points of discussion amongst our experts?
No, that was a lot of great information. Thank you, Carol. Excellent.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the chat, I did put the link to the website where Carol's resource list has already been placed up. It's ready for people to go download. It does have live hyperlinks that you can click on to be able to get directly to the information that Carol addressed today, as well as we have been recording this. And so we will go ahead and place that up on the website as quickly as possible. So we've got that set up, in addition to all of the previous recordings with Megan, Marcel, and Joanne, their presentations in the previous 3 weeks. Next week will be Kurt as our expert speaker. And remind us again what you'll be talking about.
A lot of the lessons learned by small businesses through this crisis, and how we can avoid them in the future and fix them moving forward.
Awesome. Very good. And then I will be finishing this all up in week 6 of the Now What Business series, addressing sales, because I am a sales coach. And so my presentation will be called Sales is Not a 4-Letter Word. So that way people can get back into selling in a way that doesn't feel yucky and gross and tone deaf to the times, to be able to have conversations to help solve people's problems. So I don't see any additional questions. So I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up for today. So that way, if people want to gather the information and get that. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Please feel free to share this with your friends and family who might be in small businesses in the Southern Illinois or Missouri area, although I don't know what things will necessarily apply in Missouri, because we do have slightly different regulations there. But they are welcome to come take a listen to what Kurt and I have to say moving forward. So thank you, everybody, for being here. We appreciate it, and everybody have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Great.